Hi, I'm Brad, and yes, it's another video about Valve. If you have been in the PC VR space for a long time, or even a mid-term amount of time, this video might be a little jarring to you, because things are changing in a really weird way in this industry, and some people might be excited about it, but others might feel uncomfortable. In fact, for me, kind of researching and trying to get my thoughts together to make this video was also quite tough. My last video was all about the ideas of how companies can compete with Apple's spatial computing platform, and it was really focusing on the open methods that people can do. And you'll notice in that video, I didn't speak one word about Valve. I was saving it for this video. This week, a new SteamVR beta came out with some back-end strings, enough to basically finalize my ideas on how Valve themselves is going to choose to compete in this spatial computing idea. And yes, they are going to compete very similarly to the way Apple is, but on a totally open way rather than a full-on closed platform way. But this video is also releasing on a very special day. It is the 4th year anniversary of the release of the Valve Index. 4 years since Valve has released a VR headset. And I do want to go over that headset and really the history of VR and really PC VR as I've seen it up until now. And if you don't really care about that or really don't want to hear my takes of like how that hardware has come to now and like the future, just check out the chapters. It's a long video, but I really think all of this is important. I want to first state that my obsession with Valve and VR really comes from the fact that my first experience ever trying VR was at a Valve ran event called the SteamVR Showcase back in 2016, where they were actually going, it was a press-only event where they could show off the HTC Vive Pre, which is basically very similar to the final model that would release to consumers in 2016. I bring this device up because without this, you wouldn't get to the Valve Index. And I think it's very important to think about the beginnings of Valve dipping their toes into the XR space and kind of prioritizing what they thought was important from day one. And really, of all the kind of systems that were going on at the time with this first device, or the consumer version of this first device, they were really focusing on the idea of room scale VR, which wasn't really anything that new to VR, but there was a huge focus on being stationary without any sort of ideas of walking around your room and doing things mostly related to VR gaming at the time. Valve coining the idea of room scale VR actually allowed them to sell pretty well with the HTC Vive back at the time. Obviously nothing close to mainstream numbers, but I hear multiple times that the Oculus Rift that released at the same time, and you might remember when it first released, didn't have anything related to room scale, or even 60OF controllers. It was all focused on an Xbox gamepad, that the idea was you would sit on the couch and play VR games with the actual Xbox controller. That would quickly be rectified with the Oculus Touch controllers, and then it became a war of room scale VR. And it was kind of a good, I would say, improvement as time went on. You would see things go into the more next generation with standalone. Oculus, or I should say Meta, focused on bringing this sort of room scale VR into a completely standalone package. However, there's a lot of kind of controversy around that choice. A lot of people agree that standalone is the future for devices, but a lot of people also feel that Meta also kind of jumped the gun too soon and relied on very low powered processing to do a lot of the cool things that you want. And not only that, people also felt that you needed to build out the content to make people want to get to these standalone devices and use them in a high retention sort of way. The important thing to note about this is everyone that was in the VR industry knew what Oculus was planning to release. They pretty much published some prototypes and things of kind of discussing this idea of doing everything standalone early with a low powered chip. And people had different opinions on whether that was good. Valve decided to not go that route and decided to actually make a revision, I would like to say, to the HTC Vive. The Valve Index in pretty much every way is taking a lot of the good stuff from the HTC Vive and kind of reiterating it to become a fully good, capable device that's on the high-end tier. I mean, this thing really did sell for $500 for just the headset only, but you still needed $1,000 for the full kit if you didn't have anything before, which was more expensive than the HTC Vive. However, if you compare the way that the Index released compared to the HTC Vive, it was literally a complete package compared to anything we've seen. It had controllers that did finger tracking, which was still a very new concept for anything related to XR back in the day. It had what is still kind of considered to be the best audio for this kind of spatial awareness setting. And while it's kind of funny to point out now, but the time when this headset also released, people were really raving that the screen door effect was gone. But it was really just the fact that the screen door effect on the HTC Vive with the Pentile OLED displays was so bad, and switching to an RGB stripe LCD with also a diffuser on top to make the screen door effect even less noticeable, it really felt like a next generation up in terms of PC VR quality. A lot of concepts and ideas from this headset would become kind of the standard for headsets going forward, at least high-end. The idea to adjust the actual lens depth for your eyes based on whether you're wearing glasses or if you want more FOV was something that you didn't really get out of many headsets at the time. Some of them did do it, even the HTC Vive original, but it wasn't as well done as it was on the Index. However, this video is not really to praise all aspects of the Valve Index at its launch. It clearly had many issues, to the point where the biggest one obviously to people's minds is the fact that it was not very difficult to break these headsets, or some of the controllers especially that came with them. The idea of RMAing your Index or your controllers, or even your base stations that you needed for tracking, was kind of became a meme at this point. It's always funny talking to Index owners saying that they're on their 5th RMA for controllers, or their 3rd RMA for headset, or even rebuying the full kit in general because their warranty ran out. It's really unfortunate that the headset is built pretty poorly in that way, but at the same time, I think it's also a testament to how many people really did enjoy this kit even now. I constantly see people still praising the headset so much that they just can't go to anything else. I constantly see people in the comment sections of my Deckard videos saying they'd be totally fine if Valve just released the Index with updated optics and panels, or even just panels that with a higher resolution and that's it. That's how people see the Index if you're in this niche PCVR realm. But I also think there was a lot of things that Valve kind of included in the kit, but did nothing with that frustrates me to a great degree. And they really wanted to rely on actual people or sort of tinkerers to compensate for Valve's lack of interest. The biggest thing in here is the fact that I've said before that the Index really is a mixed reality device. They were ensuring that they had these 2 global shutter cameras that run around 960 by 960 resolution per eye, which is obviously low now. You have around 4 megapixel cameras in the Quest 3 coming out per eye. But at the time, that was not something that was really focused on related to anything VR. Valve showed off some demos at press events related to the Index and kind of released some samples quietly on their GitHub, but they never updated the Valve Index website to say that they actually did release these samples. If you went to the Valve Index website right now, it would literally still say, camera samples coming soon. So it literally took actually a couple years for some people who actually did start doing stuff with the cameras to realize that that stuff was available. Which is really egregious that Valve couldn't even take like a couple minutes to update their website to let people tinker with one of the biggest features. The cameras also didn't seem to actually work well with a lot of PCs. I've seen a lot of people just disable them because they couldn't even get them working in the first place. So again, these cameras being in the headset basically became a just useless kind of concept. The next thing 4 years later after the launch of the Index, I'm still quite disappointed with the lack of interest in the frunk. The biggest use case I've seen people do it was putting these USB fans to make the cooling better. Whether or not those actually worked for most people, I thought that was kind of the most uninteresting kind of way to use the frunk, and I was hoping that Valve would give more examples of how people can do things with it. The only one that Valve gave was this idea of having an LED matrix display to display basic text. But that never caught on, and there was never really that much volume to buy that for this if you really cared that much about it. Some of the best things I have seen with the use of the frunk though was really just the idea of putting eye tracking on the Index thanks to the open source community. iTrack VR is a fantastic thing being built by people who really care about this medium, and it's really important to note that because I think the open source community is also going to be a big help to the future hardware that Valve plans to release. I don't want to end on a negative note for the Index. The Index, even now, is probably the closest thing in my heart to the best all-in-one PC VR headset. And really, while the HTC Vive got me into VR, the Valve Index made me stay in VR for way longer than the Vive did, by a pretty big margin. And another testament to just how people like me and other people who have the Index love it so much are even willing to spend a considerable amount of money 4 years later to buy the Nofio kit to make it go wireless. That Kickstarter basically blew up even more than I expected because people respect the hardware so much and they just want to keep it going because they just love the platform and the openness that the PC gives you. Now, this leads me to Valve's future hardware for VR. It's really weird because even though I said all these positive things about the Index and the HTC Vive, they basically were peripherals for a main PC. They are not standalone in any capacity, and that has given people very great experiences with it, but in some ways, never allowed the SteamVR platform to grow in ways that I think is very healthy for the entire medium. I want to state that I don't think XR is a mainstream technology for at least 10 years, but I do think that there is these steps that people must take in the industry if you're a big company to get closer to that. I think the Valve Index is great for people who are this niche enthusiasts, but I do want to talk about the next level and what things are going to become related to XR. And it goes back to my spatial computing videos I've been recently making. So as I said at the beginning of this video, Valve released a new SteamVR beta, and there honestly wasn't too much new related to Deckard. There were some updates of many things I talked about before related to pass-through portals in SteamVR to be able to mark out different 3D mesh shapes to be able to see your real world based on however you want to do it. They updated the incognito mode stuff. They updated some related stuff to the gamepad UI, which they call the VR gamepad UI, which is their version of the Steam Deck's UI, bringing it to SteamVR. But there was one set of strings in there that really piqued my mind and made me realize fully what Valve's long-term vision is for the Deckard, or even the SteamOS platform in itself. So SteamOS, if you don't know by now, is the actual operating system that the Steam Deck runs. It was completely designed from the ground up at an Arch-based x86 operating system to allow you to easily jump into a GameScope compositor, which is the gamepad UI, to run very performantly on a mobile APU. The interesting thing about the version of SteamOS that released on the deck, SteamOS 3, is it was codenamed Hollow, which is funny because if you put Hollow and Deck together, you get Holodeck. I know I pointed that out many times, but I do think it's very relevant. Now, immediately when you boot into SteamOS on a Steam Deck, you are led to a console-like UI that's being run under a compositor called GameScope. And I've been saying for a while that this GameScope compositor has been getting constant updates in their GitHub of all these things related to VR. The Steam Deck has nothing to do with VR, and I don't think the Steam Deck has any plans to do anything with VR. But it's very important to Valve to not only port OpenVR to GameScope and allow GameScope to run in OpenVR, which is SteamVR, but making everything work in a headless environment and do all these things related to XR. It's very clear to me by now that Valve is going to release a headset running an x86 APU inside for a full standalone experience. Now, this is where also things get weird because there's not only a big focus on being able to have a VR environment run in an x86 APU environment, but there's a huge focus and many data mining and many strings to bring 2D games, such as ones that you would play on a Steam Deck, into a fantastic XR desktop environment. There's been theater modes that don't really work fully with the current Steam VR. You can get some things running, but they're just not exactly there. There's a lot of focus on making these 2D windows being able to give off reflections and what seems to be dynamic lighting to light up a VR environment as you play these 2D games. I actually think Valve is going to position their next headset as not only a VR device, but as a high-end Steam Deck device that can play all of your games inside this very immersive environment on top of everything else. But that's not all. I don't think that GameScope or this console UI coming to SteamVR and the Deckard is the final thing that Valve is really focusing on and kind of building out this idea for a long-term plan. In the most recent SteamVR beta, the strings that kind of piqued my mind more than anything was related to a shutdown feature that was added in January 2022. That was very strange. It was able to be activated to work in the UI for SteamVR, but upon pressing it, it did nothing. I want to note that that button still does nothing, but Valve has been updating that string to be more fleshed out and give an idea of what it's actually going to do. If you press what is called the Steam button on the Steam Deck, you can go down to Power Options and click what is a button called Exit to Desktop. This will make you reboot into a different compositor that's fully like a Linux PC. Valve has always kind of advertised the Steam Deck as not really a gaming console or a gaming handheld, but a full-blown PC. And this is the functionality that I think Valve is going to use on the Deckard to actually call it a spatial computing unit or whatever else they want to call it. The strings in the most recent beta show a very similar idea where if you don't want to have just a full gaming experience, a full SteamVR experience is running on standalone, you can also turn it into an actual mobile computer, a spatial computer, very similar to what Apple is doing. I think when someone has a Valve Deckard headset, they'll be able to open the very similar power menu, similar to the one on the Steam Deck, go down to something called Exit Open VR or something like the shutdown button, and it will not turn off the device. I believe that button will actually close the console-like UI and take you to something called XR Desktop, which is something that's been open source and funded by Valve to kind of be able to allow you to create a bunch of windows and open apps in sort of this VR or AR environment and control them any way you want. I never could piece together how this XR Desktop program would fit into all this until I started thinking about the spatial computing concept. And the idea of Deckard is not only just to make a gaming device or a Steam Deck for the face, but in the long term rely on the huge open source Linux community to build out a fully open spatial computing platform. I want to make a shout out to a group of people that work on something called Monado, which is a fantastic platform that I've seen some amazing things done with just the Valve Index, for example. They've enabled stuff such as hand tracking with just your fingers and using the Valve Index cameras, which definitely don't work that well for that kind of idea, but they did it anyway, and it works fantastic. They were also able to build a fully open source SLAM tracking system with the cameras as well. These are all amazing things because the group effort of these Omega enthusiasts for XR just came together to build this because they love the platform. And I think Valve is really going to push this idea of relying on these open source devs because they're really a small company, and this is how they can kind of compete or put their stake in the ground in this spatial computing platform against Apple, who has way more devs than they have than Valve can ever think of having working on this one goal. And Apple, of course, also has the big benefit of a closed platform that lets them do things in ways that other companies just can't. So I really do think that we're entering this era of spatial computing for VR devices. I don't think that you'll see them as game consoles, even if they're advertised as that to get the mainstream people. Even people who just play 2D games only are not interested or get sick with 3D or VR games, to kind of start adopting these devices as replacements or mobile laptops that you put on your face. Having a fully open Linux computer on your head allows you to have many more access to actual productivity apps that are on the system. And Valve building out Proton, which is based on Wine, will allow you to also run the huge amount of Windows apps that you can also run in a Linux environment as this Wine and Proton keeps getting better and better, which is already happening very, very strongly right now. So this idea is if you don't want a Mac HMD because you just don't like the Mac platform, I do think Valve's plan is to make what Apple is doing, but relying on what you see on the Steam Deck and Linux. What will Valve do with VR gaming? Well, I do still believe that Valve is going to let you do stuff with this headset related to VR gaming and allow you to connect it to more powerful PCs. There's a lot of references to VR Link, which is a wireless PC VR streaming between your main PC and this headset that's being worked on right now. So that is still in the cards, but I think Valve does want to focus more on building out this whole spatial computing platform, get more 2D people on the platform, and then get them into VR slowly. Because the biggest issue that VR has had, whether we like to admit it or not, is VR games have been very bare bones, and there's not many AAA developers wanting to develop for this. It's all been indie, which is great. I'm very happy that indies have really been able to make a lot of money from VR gaming, but we really need to build this actual VR, AR, XR thing past that point. And I think getting people to understand 2D windows in a spatial environment is how companies are going to do it from now on. Some companies. There's also some things that you could just flat out do better in VR related to 2D windows than your monitor or TV. You can put yourself in environments that are related to that actual game you're playing to become more immersive. You can have effects come out of the screen. You can do 3D VR, 3D of 2D games, much better than any of the 3D monitors that we've had so far. You can think of every display that you make, every 2D display you make in a spatial computing device as a software upgradable monitor that can change, very similar to like hardware just randomly changing off of the bat. And then anytime you want to hop into a VR environment, those games will still exist and come out slowly too. All right, that is everything I had to say about this kind of device. Happy 4-year anniversary of Index, and I don't know when the Deckard is coming out, but I really do think everything I said here is going to be the big long-term goals for not just Valve, but a lot of these companies making these VR headsets from now on in the high end. Bye!